If you saw silver futures do something violent in the middle of New Year's night, don't get hypnotized by the number. The real story is what happens when liquidity is thin and margin rules bite. And I'm going to be careful. The exact 3 a.m. print claims are unverified, but the plumbing pattern we can verify is what matters. Let me slow this down and put a guardrail around it right away. In silver, there are two worlds that touch each other but don't behave the same way. The paper world, futures, clearing, margin, and the physical world, real metal, real delivery, real replacement cost. On my screen, I've got a simple timeline from late December into New Year's week. And I'm not here to hype up one scary print. I'm here to separate what's confirmed from what's still noise, because this topic gets loud fast. So I'm going to use a plain language ladder as we go. Confirmed means there's a real trail behind it. A rule change, a published framework, a widely reported notice. Likely means the mechanism makes sense, but we don't have every link pinned down. Early signs means it's a watch item you verify with real pricing terms, not emotion. And unverified means you do not build conclusions on it until you can check it. Two quick definitions, because if you miss these, you miss everything. Liquidity is just how many real buyers and sellers are active right now. When liquidity is thin, there aren't many bids to catch a fall. Margin is the cash you must post to hold a leveraged futures position. When volatility rises, margin can be raised, sometimes quickly. And three more terms I'll keep in plain English. A premium is the extra amount paid above a reference price. Replacement cost is what it actually costs to restock real metal. Lead time is how long it takes to get delivery. Those three are how the physical world tells you what's really happening. Now, here's the first clean anchor point. Late December. Public reporting around that window pointed to higher margin requirements as volatility picked up. That's the system tightening the seatbelt. Exchanges and clearinghouses raise margin to reduce default risk when markets whip around. But that safety lever can still force behavior. When margin goes up, leveraged traders don't get to debate theory. They either post more cash or they cut exposure. If enough players are forced to cut at the same time, you get forced flow, selling that's about survival, not about getting the perfect price. And if that happens during thin hours, the print can overshoot because the order book is shallow. Second anchor point, the physical supply side. China has published an official framework around export licensing and state trading that includes silver in scope for 2026 to 2027. That framework existing is confirmed. What is not confirmed, from the dataset we've locked here, is the exact magnitude of the day-to-day impact outside China. So the responsible framing is conditional. Tighter licensing can add friction and uncertainty to supply routes, which can keep replacement costs firm even when paper prices wobble. That's how a paper-physical disconnect can start showing up. A quick dip on a future screen does not automatically make your supplier cheaper. It doesn't shorten lead times. It doesn't change the cost of restocking inventory. In the physical world, those are the anchors. Now let's address the headline chatter. There are claims floating around about a specific New Year's overnight move, sometimes described as a 3 a.m. print into the high 60s. I'm treating the exact time, exact low, and any who sold story as unverified unless we can independently verify it. And I'm not going to throw around words like attack or manipulation without evidence. There's also a claim that often rides with it, that physical pricing didn't mirror the paper move. That is not confirmed in what we've locked. Treat it as an early sign at best, something you verify with reputable quotes, observed premiums, and delivery terms. So here's the takeaway for this first section. A dramatic futures print, especially in thin liquidity, can be a stress test, not a verdict. The plumbing, liquidity, margin rules, and delivery constraints can create moments where the screen looks shocking while the real-world supply chain hasn't meaningfully changed. And to be clear, this is not financial advice. My goal is to map the mechanism and give you signals you can verify. Before we go further, picture how these two worlds connect. The paper market is where huge volumes trade quickly, often with leverage. It's used for hedging and for price discovery. The physical market is slower and practical. It's about sourcing metal, moving it, insuring it, and actually delivering it. That's why I'll keep repeating one rule. A paper quote can change in seconds, but the physical pipeline can't. A refinery can't magically increase output because a chart went down. A dealer can't restock faster because a futures candle looks scary. Real supply moves on schedules, contracts, and logistics. On this desk, I'm tracking 3 kinds of signals. 1. Rules and risk controls, margin changes, clearing requirements, anything that tightens leverage. 2. Deliverability signals, premiums, lead times, and whether quotes come with new restrictions. 3. Liquidity behavior, those sudden air pockets where the market drops into a void. When you hear people argue about silver, notice what they often miss. They'll argue like the price is a single truth. But there are layers, the price of leverage and the price of immediate delivery. Under stress, those layers can separate. Let me translate clearinghouse logic without jargon. The clearing system is designed to make sure trades settle even when someone is wrong. So when volatility rises, it asks for more margin. That protects the system, but it also forces participants to shrink positions. When enough participants shrink at the same time, the market becomes one-sided. And this matters because of who tends to be active in each layer. In the paper layer, you've got exchanges, clearing, banks, market makers, and funds. In the physical layer, you've got refiners, dealers, industrial buyers, vaulting, and regulators. The incentives are different. The paper layer can dump risk in milliseconds. The physical layer has to think about restocking and delivery. So if you're looking for a systemic story, it's not a movie moment. It's this. When risk controls tighten, paper can become unstable at the exact time the physical pipeline is constrained or uncertain. That's when the reference price, the number everyone quotes, can become less trusted for a period of time. That separation is the signal, not the headline number, period. So here's the plan. We start with the cleanest anchor point in this story, late December, because it proves what margin and liquidity can do. Then we add the policy/supply friction backdrop and see how a paper-physical gap can form. To understand the New Year's chatter, you don't start at 3 a.m. You start at the part we can anchor. Risk controls tightened, leverage got squeezed, and liquidity became more fragile. That's how markets become vulnerable to extreme prints, especially in thin holiday hours. In part 1, I set one rule. Don't treat a dramatic print as a verdict. Treat it like a stress signal, then trace the plumbing. Now I'm going to show you the clean chain of cause and effect that makes those stress signals possible, without guessing who did anything, and without turning inference into fact. On my screen, I've split the last couple of weeks into 3 lanes. Lane A is risk controls, margin and clearing rules that change how much leverage the system will tolerate. Lane B is policy and supply friction, the kind of headlines that can change expectations around replacement cost and deliverability. Lane C is market behavior, volatility and liquidity, what actually happens when those first 2 lanes interact. Start with what's confirmed. In late December, public reporting pointed to higher margin requirements as volatility picked up. That's a rule change, not a mood. And the minute margin goes up, it raises the cost of carrying futures positions. If you're leveraged, you either post more cash or reduce exposure. That's the first mechanical push. Here's the likely part, clearly labeled. When a bunch of participants reduce exposure at the same time, you get forced flow. It doesn't have to be panic. Can be compliance. Can be a risk limit. It can be a model saying, cut size. The result is the same. More selling pressure hitting the book than the book is prepared to absorb. And forced flow has a tell. It tends to be price insensitive. It hits the market because the priority is exit, not negotiation. In a crowded session, that kind of selling can still get absorbed because there are more bids stacked underneath. In a thin session, it can feel like the floor disappears, not because the metal became worthless, but because there weren't enough real buyers sitting there at that moment. Let me make that concrete in plain English. Imagine a leveraged fund that's long futures. Volatility spikes, margin gets raised, and suddenly that fund has to post more collateral by a deadline. If it can't or won't, then it sells contracts. Not because it changed its mind about silver, but because it has to meet a cash requirement. The clearing system doesn't grade your thesis. It grades your collateral. That's why these moves can look irrational on a chart while still being perfectly rational inside the risk system. And when multiple desks are using similar volatility thresholds, they can start cutting at the same time. In thin liquidity, that synchronization is the difference between a dip and a cliff. That's also why the ugliest candles show up in holiday hours. Fewer eyes, fewer bids. The same forced order travels farther when the book is thin for anyone. Now add the thin hours factor. Holiday sessions and overnight windows can be strangely empty. You don't have the same number of market makers leaning in. You don't have the same depth across price levels. So even a normal amount of forced flow can look abnormal. It can slice through levels that would normally hold. And once the market starts moving fast, volatility rises again, feeding right back into the margin loop. That loop is the pattern. Volatility pushes margin higher, higher margin pushes deleveraging, deleveraging thins liquidity, thin liquidity makes volatility worse. It's a self-reinforcing cycle. And notice what I'm not saying. I'm not saying it proves manipulation. I'm saying it explains how you can get violent prints without needing a grand narrative to exist. If you want to verify this pattern in real time, you don't need secret order flow. You watch the public levers, margin updates and rule notices. You watch the behavior. Does the market gap in thin hours? Do moves look air pocket fast? And you watch what happens when normal liquidity returns. Do prices stabilize? Or do they keep breaking in the same fragile windows? There's another detail people miss. Futures are a leveraged reference price. They're incredibly useful, but under stress they can become a liquidity price, the price of exiting risk right now. Physical markets, by contrast, are closer to a replacement price, the price of getting metal and delivering it. When leverage is being squeezed, those two prices can diverge even if nothing mystical happened to the metal itself. Now bring in lane B, the supply and policy backdrop. The confirmed fact in our locked dataset is that China published an export licensing and state trading framework that includes silver in scope for 2026 and 2027. That exists. What we do not have locked as confirmed is the exact magnitude of its immediate impact outside China. So here's the responsible framing. Tighter licensing can increase friction. Friction can show up as uncertainty, delays, or extra steps that make supply less flexible at the margin. And that's where physical terms matter. Physical markets don't reprice on a 5-minute candle the way leveraged futures can. Physical pricing is anchored to replacement cost, what it costs to restock, and lead time, how long delivery actually takes. If your supplier hasn't lowered their invoice and your next shipment still takes weeks, you don't suddenly sell cheaper because a screen printed a low during thin liquidity. This is also why people watch premiums. A premium is simply the extra amount paid above a reference price. When the physical premium stays firm, it's often the market's way of saying, immediate deliverable metal is still not easy to replace, even if paper trades are whipping around. So step back and look at the structure. Lane A tightens leverage through margin. Lane C shows you the behavioral response. Forced flow plus thinner liquidity equals bigger intraday moves. Lane B adds supply uncertainty that can keep physical pricing sticky. Put those together and you have a world where paper can look unstable while physical can look steady. That's not a contradiction. That's two layers reacting to different constraints. If you want a quick reality check, stop asking only, what is the price? And start asking, what is the system charging you to carry risk? And what is the system charging you to get delivery? Those are different questions. And when they diverge, the divergence itself is information. One more guardrail. Because we don't have verified data here on any specific 3 a.m. print, we also don't claim that a single overnight move was the cause of anything. The point is that late December mechanics can set the stage. They can make the market sensitive. They can make thin windows dangerous. That's why the clean anchor in the story is the margin response, not the screenshot. Now we're ready to connect the dots in a way that matters. We've got a confirmed risk control lever that can trigger forced behavior. We've got a confirmed policy framework that can add friction to physical supply channels. The open question is what happens when those two triggers overlap while liquidity is thin and participants are already defensive. Now we're ready for the real pivot. What happens when this paper plumbing is stressed? and you add a supply chain gate on top of it, that's where the paper-physical gap becomes the signal, and we can map the triggers and the failure points. Here's where this stops being a strange holiday chart and starts looking like a system story. Paper can break fast under margin and liquidity stress, while physical can stay firm if delivery and replacement costs don't loosen. And when that gap widens, it's not a cheat code, it's a warning label. We've already anchored one thing you can verify without trusting anyone's narrative. When volatility spikes, exchanges and clearing can tighten risk controls, margin can ratchet up, and leveraged positions can get squeezed. In that environment, price can move because the system is forcing behavior, not because the metal suddenly changed its industrial value at 3:17 in the morning. Now I'm going to add the second layer, the one that determines whether this is just a rough patch on a chart or a broader stress story. On my screen, I'm putting up a simple 2 triggers card. Trigger A is paper plumbing, margin pressure plus thin liquidity. Trigger B is physical friction. Anything that makes replacement costs sticky, lead times longer, or deliverability less flexible. When those 2 triggers overlap, that's when a paper reference price can drift away from the real-world price of metal you can actually get. Let's walk through trigger A first, fast and clean. Futures markets trade huge size quickly, often with leverage. Clearinghouses exist to make sure every trade settles. When volatility rises, they can demand more margin. That forces some players, funds, banks, CTAs, market makers to shrink exposure. The key detail is timing. If that shrinking happens during thin liquidity, the screen price becomes the price of exiting risk right now. It's a liquidity price. It can overshoot, and it can print levels that look unreal for a few minutes because the order book is thin. Now trigger B. This is slower and more practical. It's not about the next candle. It's about the next shipment. The confirmed fact we have locked is that China published an export licensing and state trading framework that includes silver in scope for 2026 and 2027. What we do not have locked is a verified, quantified impact on global flows in the first days of January. So the correct framing is conditional. Licensing can add friction, and friction can change behavior even before you see a clean, simple headline that tells you exactly what changed. Here's what friction looks like in plain English. If an exporter has to clear more steps, timelines become less certain. When timelines become less certain, buyers who need metal on schedule start paying for certainty. And sellers who don't want to get caught underpricing inventory they can't easily replace, protect themselves by widening spreads, holding premiums, or tightening quote terms. None of that requires the futures price to behave calmly. It's a risk response inside the physical pipeline. This is where people get confused, so I'm going to say it plainly. A futures print is not a shipment. A chart does not put metal in a box, insure it, clear it through customs, and deliver it to an industrial buyer. Physical markets price the hassle, replacement cost, and lead time, because those are the constraints that decide whether you can actually get the metal when you need it. Now, you may hear 2 claims in the wild. Claim 1. There was a specific 3 a.m. print in the high 60s. In our locked set, that exact print is unverified. Claim 2. Physical didn't follow it. Also unverified. But even without those claims, the mechanism we're mapping is still valid. Under stress, paper can move violently while physical terms move slowly, or even tighten. So how do you tell the difference between paper noise and system strain? You don't guess motives. You look for observable changes in the physical layer. Do premiums stay firm or widen? Do lead times stretch? Do quotes come with extra conditions? Do dealers and wholesalers change how long they'll hold a price for? Do industrial buyers talk about longer procurement cycles? You're not proving a conspiracy. You're checking whether deliverability is getting harder. And that's where the story becomes systemic. I'm going to list the mechanical places where stress can propagate. Not accusations, failure points. First, the liquidity vacuum. In thin sessions, fewer bids exist. If forced selling hits, the market can drop into an air pocket. That's not the market discovering truth. That's the absence of depth. Second, the margin spiral. Volatility rises, margin rises, leverage shrinks, liquidity thins, volatility rises again. Once that loop starts, you can get repeated shocks even if the fundamentals didn't change hour to hour. Third, capital constraints. People love to say, if paper is cheap and physical is expensive, arbitrage will fix it. Sometimes it does. But convergence takes capital, balance sheet, and margin capacity. If margin is rising, fewer players can step in, carry risk, and wait for settlement. That slows the fix, and it can allow a disconnect to persist longer than people expect. Fourth, delivery timing. Paper can trade enormous notional size in seconds. Physical delivery happens on schedules. If a buyer needs metal by a deadline, they price certainty. If certainty is scarce, they pay for it. That's how a premium can persist even when a futures quote is whipping around. Fifth, hedging friction. Large parts of the physical supply chain hedge price exposure in the paper market. When paper is violently unstable, hedging becomes more expensive and more unpredictable at the worst moment. That can tighten quoting, widen spreads, and reinforce the premium, again as a risk response, not as a headline event. Now bring those failure points back to the center and ask the only question that matters. What would it look like if this is about the system, not just the price? It would look like paper volatility plus tighter risk controls at the same time physical terms get less forgiving. It would look like a reference price that moves fast, while the cost of delivery doesn't budge the way you'd expect. Here's the twist, and I want you to really hear it. A paper-physical disconnect isn't a gift. It isn't a magic coupon. It's a warning label that says the plumbing is tight: margin, liquidity, delivery, and capital. And the tighter that plumbing gets, the less you should trust a single thin-hour print to represent the whole market. One more angle before we move on. This is also about confidence in the reference. Futures are supposed to be the clean, central price that everyone can quote. But under stress, that reference can get noisy because it reflects leverage management as much as supply and demand. Physical buyers still look at the reference, but they negotiate on terms. How fast can you deliver? How long is that quote good for? And what happens if the shipment is delayed? When those terms tighten, the market is quietly telling you that certainty is getting expensive. And notice how this changes the narrative. It's not silver is up or silver is down. It's the system is charging more for certainty. That's a signal non-trader can understand. And that's why thin-hour spikes matter. They can shake confidence and trigger tighter behavior, wider spreads, shorter quote windows, and more demand for immediate metal. If you're a fund, you think in margin. If you're a manufacturer, you think in delivery. When both start flashing red, you don't need a prediction, you need a checklist. That's the shift from chart watching to system watching. So what do you do with that? You don't pick a team and you don't worship the chart. You track the warning lights and let the evidence tell you which layer is driving the action. Watch the tape. So the question isn't, what's the next price candle? The question is, do these warning lights fade, or do they intensify? Let's map 3 scenarios and a watch list you can verify in real time, without taking my word for anything. What happens next won't be decided by vibes or a single overnight print. It'll be decided by whether margin pressure cools and whether physical availability actually loosens. So here are 3 scenarios, and a checklist you can use next week to see which one reality is picking. Quick anchor from what we just mapped. Paper can swing fast when the plumbing is stressed, and physical can stay sticky when replacement cost and delivery don't loosen. So instead of guessing motives or worshipping a single candle, we're going to run a simple risk board, 3 outcomes, and a checklist you can verify. On my screen, I'm laying out a scenario board. 3 columns. Under each one, I'm writing 2 lines, what has to be true, and what you would actually see. This keeps us honest. It forces us to separate a story from a signal, and it keeps us from overreacting to one thin-hour print. Scenario 1 is normalization. This is the boring outcome, but boring is real. In this scenario, volatility cools down, margin stops ratcheting higher, and normal depth returns during regular trading hours. The mechanism is straightforward. If margin pressure eases, forced deleveraging fades, market makers step back in, and price action starts to look less mechanical. What would you see? Fewer air pocket drops in the thinnest windows, fewer straight-line candles, and more two-way trade around key levels. On the physical side, you'd expect quote terms to relax. Premiums narrow, quote windows lengthen, lead times stabilize, and sellers are willing to hold a price a little longer. The paper reference and the real-world replacement price start moving together again. Scenario 2 is sustained strain. Here, volatility stays elevated and risk controls stay tight, while physical availability signals don't really loosen. The system can still function, but it runs hot. Paper remains jumpy because leverage is expensive and liquidity is thinner than usual, especially outside peak hours, so the market can still lurch on forced flow. On the physical side, sellers protect themselves because restocking is uncertain or slow, so premiums and terms stay firm. What would you see? A recurring pattern of sharp moves during off hours, and a physical market that stays defensive. Premiums remain firm, inventory labels flip to limited more often, and delivery estimates remain longer than usual. The paper-physical gap doesn't vanish. It just oscillates, and the system stays sensitive to forced flow. Scenario 3 is a conditional strain event. I'm choosing my words carefully. This is a risk map, not a forecast. This is what it looks like if a larger forced unwind hits while liquidity is poor and the physical pipeline is still tight or uncertain. The mechanism is the same loop, just bigger. Volatility rises, margin tightens, liquidity thins, and participants become more defensive all at once. In that environment, the reference price can get noisy for a period of time because the screen is reflecting the price of exiting leveraged risk, not the convenience price of immediate metal. You might see wider spreads, shorter quote windows, and more call for availability behavior. You might also hear more talk about settlement and delivery terms, not as a guarantee of failure, but as a sign that participants are thinking about plumbing, not just price. Now, the checklist. I'm keeping it in 3 buckets because that's all you need to watch the plumbing without getting lost. First bucket, margin and rules. Watch for margin updates, clearing notices, or any change that alters the cost of carrying futures exposure. If margin keeps rising, that's the system saying, less leverage. Less leverage usually means more forced behavior and thinner liquidity. If margin stops rising or eases, that's the system saying stress is cooling. Also watch the cadence. Frequent, reactive adjustments suggest the system is chasing volatility. Calmer updates suggest the system is stabilizing. Second bucket, physical availability. Watch premiums relative to the reference price, lead times, and the way quotes are offered. Are sellers widening spreads? Are quote windows getting shorter? Are there new conditions around payment, minimum size, or delivery timing? Are wholesalers slower to confirm availability? You can often see this without calling anyone. Posted prices, in-stock/backorder labels, and shipping estimates. Physical markets don't reprice on a 5-minute candle. They reprice on replacement cost and scheduling. If those terms tighten, that's information. If those terms loosen, that's information too. Third bucket, liquidity and volatility. Watch the character of the moves. Are the biggest drops and spikes happening when the book is thin? Does volatility stay elevated for days, not minutes? Do you see signs of position reduction, like open interest shrinking during stress? You're not hunting a villain. You're measuring whether the market is functioning smoothly or functioning under strain. Here's the discipline. Don't cherry-pick one metric. 1 bucket flashing can be noise. 2 buckets flashing together is a signal. 3 buckets flashing together is when you stop thinking normal volatility and start thinking system stress. Mixed signals are normal. You might see the screen rally while premiums hold, or the screen drop while sellers refuse to change quotes. When that happens, don't pick the one you like. Mark it as mixed, and wait for a second bucket to confirm. The whole point of this framework is to keep you from being whipsawed by the paper tape while the physical side moves on a different clock. If you only remember one thing, remember this. Stress shows up first in terms, margin terms, delivery terms, and quote terms before it shows up in headlines. That's the part most people miss, and it's why this story is about plumbing, not vibes. If you want a simple routine, do this once a day for 5 minutes. Check margin or rule updates. Check a couple of reputable physical quote snapshots for premium and delivery timing. Then look at the chart only to answer one question. Did the ugliest move happen in a thin window? You're not predicting. You're classifying the environment. And the environment tells you which scenario is being confirmed. One last reminder before we close. The most viral claims in this space, exact thin-hour lows, who sold, and stories about physical ignoring paper are unverified in our locked dataset. So don't let those claims drive your conclusion. Let the checklist drive it. Track what's measurable. Track what's repeatable. Track what would have to change for the story to flip. And yes, this is not financial advice. This is a framework to keep you rational when screens get emotional. If two of these buckets flash at the same time, margin up, physical premiums/lead times up, liquidity worse, that's when this stops being volatile. In December 2025, the real concern wasn't just the silver price moving. It was the system behind it. Physical supply, delivery, settlement, and the trust that holds all of that together, coming under strain. So don't fixate on one number on a screen. Watch the system signals and always ask, is this confirmed? Or is it still something that needs verification? If you follow the checklist instead of reacting to fear, you'll be harder to shake out when the market jolts. When pressure builds at a choke point, price is just the surface. What matters is whether the pipeline still flows or starts to clog.